So you'll be pleased to know that mountains do exist. But that's not a trivial assertion. I have prepared rather a large number of slides. I will go through some of them quite quickly. I will ignore some of them if we run out of time. Basically, I want to run out of time because I want you to interrupt me wherever and whenever possible. So the goal is that you should understand everything I say but never be bored. So you should interrupt me if I'm being boring. The goal is also that you agree with everything I say. And so if you disagree, then you should interrupt me so that I can get you straight. Now, the assumption underlying what I will say goes something like this. In very many areas, including biodiversity research, including practically all areas, people are facing the same problems, namely gigantic legacy data stovepipes. It's too late to do what we should have done, which is to create some kind of ethics for database designers. So what we would really need is a Hippocratic oath that would commit database designers to reusing existing database designs rather than inventing new stuff for each new customer. And I will leave a pause after the word customer. It's too late for that. We have to try and find some prospective solution to the problem of data stovepipes. And the biomedical area is an area where a lot of money has been invested towards creating such a prospective solution. And the prospective solution, in simple terms, goes something like this. You have many, many data stovepipes. You have a smaller number of groups who are attempting to describe the data in those stovepipes in a common way that would be cross-stovepipe. And what they use to describe those data are called ontologies, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in due course. They use those ontologies to describe the data in a stovepipe-neutral way, and thereby the stovepipes become, when viewed through the spectacles of the ontologies, in some degree, unified or integrated. It becomes possible to do searches, indexing across the stovepipes. In the longer term, it becomes possible to do some kinds of analysis and quality control for the data in the stovepipes. We're still not much further than basic search and indexing, but we are beginning to understand more and more about what is needed to make this strategy work. Now, the strategy is partly a technical one. I will not talk very much about technical details here, but if there are questions, I can point you in the right directions. It's also a sociological problem. People have egos, and people think that they own data. And people think that because they've been describing their data in this particular way for more than 30 years, this must be the right way to describe their data. And so most of what I'll be talking about are strategies for overcoming the egos of people who have data. And that means we have to flatter them, humiliate them, use all the usual. I'll be doing some humiliating tomorrow when we talk about the Darwin core. So today there are two sections. Section one, which I hope will be the morning section, concerns what we did in certain areas, particularly medically related areas of biology, and what we're trying to continue to do in those areas, why it's been successful in some senses, why it's been a failure in other senses, what the governance processes are that we need to use in order to make it successful, and some tricks that you can learn. And some of you will know these tricks, but I will give you some tricks which I believe can help to make this strategy more successful. So that's the morning. And in some, you can say the morning is about ontologies. And then in the afternoon, I want to talk about data. And I'm thinking now about data of the sort which is assembled or are assembled when you find a sample, you label the sample, you describe the sample, you make a report on the description which corrects some of the description 10 years later, and you want to assemble all of the other people who are describing the same sample, all of those people have data, and you want to put all of that data together in such a way that you can know that it's all data about that particular sample, even though you have 7 different and conflicting descriptions of what the sample is. Now, this is only partly an ontological problem, but we have, in a quite different context, namely medical samples, developed some ideas and tools which are being used to solve problems which are very similar, I believe, to the kinds of problems that you have when dealing with samples. So I'm just going to describe this set of solutions, and as I say, I'm hoping that you will interrupt me whenever necessary, so that if it seems that the tools I'm describing are completely irrelevant, then we will just move to some other different approach. But I think that what I'm going to be saying will prove to be relevant. Now, in both the morning, so morning is ontology, afternoon is data. Morning, if you like, is about what is general. So it's about things like sample, cell, organism, environment, population, general terms. In the afternoon, we're talking about what is specific. So it's about this particular laptop and the bacteria crawling around inside its keyboard, here and now. In both cases, I will be describing the results of several years' work, which is what you might call academic work. In other words, it's being done by researchers to experiment with possibilities. In the ontology side, this academic work is already being implemented. It's already being used in every drug company, every major research hospital uses the ontologies I'll be talking about. In the afternoon, the data stuff I'm going to be talking about is much more experimental. It's being used by some hospitals. You will see what can be done with it, I hope. It brings a much clearer approach to handling data than the usual approaches. And all of that will become clear as the day goes on, I hope. So, are there any questions? Good. So let's start the morning then. First of all, this meeting is called Semantics for Biodiversity. And the reason why we gave it that name is because of the growth in importance of the Semantic Web. And the Semantic Web is a dream that one should be able to reap the benefits of the internet for doing science, or for creating a coherent internet within which the data in different websites, whether it's scientific data or other sorts of data, would become compatible in something like the way I described a minute ago, compatible through the use of ontologies. So the basis of the Semantic Web is the development of languages which are more constrained than HTML, of which the most important for our purposes is something called the Web Ontology Language, or OWL. And the idea behind the Semantic Web is that we can use OWL to formulate ontologies which will be acceptable to the users and holders of data, so that they will describe their data using OWL. And because we'll all be using OWL, and because OWL is a standard which supports linking, then the data itself will become linked. And so this is a similar strategy is the strategy used by Google. So Google links data. And Google is increasingly exploring the possibility of enhancing the way it links data using ontologies. But the strategy is obviously an attractive strategy. So another way of describing it is that we break down data silos by developing controlled vocabularies for the description, first of all, of the data dictionaries, and then of the data themselves. And the more we have structured data, the more we will only need to describe the data dictionaries, the data headings. But if we have unstructured data, then we're not going to get the data column contents without extra work. But that's a detail which we will leave aside. However, so all of that is wonderful, fantastic, vision, anarchy, internet, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the more people get hold of this OWL thing, and the more they start to use it, the more anarchy prevails. So the more successful is the approach, the more silos we create. Now these are semantic silos, because everybody wants to have their own ontology. Ontology is a good thing. We want to have one too. We can get more money from our customers if we build our own local Santa Barbara ontology of this or that. And all of these ontologies are unconstrained. So we're back to the old unconstrained days of HTML. It's just now, instead of using HTML, we're using XML or RDF or some other somewhat more constrained syntax. But the semantics, the content, the meanings of the terms are still unconstrained because there's no governance. Governance is applied to the syntax, to the logic of OWL, but not to the content of OWL. Now, this is why if you see a thing like this called linked open data, you should be very suspicious. If you look down at the bottom here, you can't see this, but there are things like Gene ID and Drug Bank and KEGG and Uniprot and Unipark and so forth. These are all ontologies, or they are ontology-driven data collections which make some sort of a sense, and they are linked together in some sort of a coherent way. But if you go up to the top, you see things like Audio Scrobbler, or BBC John Peel, or Pub Guide, which is probably a pub guide for Derbyshire or somewhere in the UK. So there's something fishy here. And if you look at the most recent versions of the linked open data, then it gets even more fishy because there are more and more things which are linked. None of these links mean very much, unless you're down here in a relatively constrained area where there is some kind of governance. Out here, again, the BBC is rather good at ontologies as it happens, but it doesn't have anything to do with genes or protein interactions. And if people think that this really is some sort of a coherent set of linked open data, then they're making a mistake. All right, now, I really do believe that we are recreating silos. Some people are rather relaxed about this. And they say, it doesn't matter if we create silos because we will still have OWL, we'll still have a relatively coherent logic, and then we can use mappings so that the silos created over here will be mapped to the silos created over here, and then we'll still get this shared search, index, retrieval, and eventually we'll get analysis capabilities across all of the data. Now, I think mappings are a sign of defeat. If you need to have mappings, then that means that you've done something wrong. So it's a bit like having a supermarket with two different sets of price lists. And when you go to the checkout, the checkout person has to check whether you've used price list 1 or price list 2 and then do some calculation to work out how much to charge you. It's a sign of some management problem. We've not done our job properly. Even if it works. But of course it doesn't work. And so if you look at some of the mappings which were created for biomedical ontologies, very many ontologies use all to name the topmost term of the ontology. So all phenotypes is the name of the topmost term of the human phenotype ontology. And all organisms is the name of one topmost term in the NCI, which is the National Cancer Institute Thesaurus. Now, aloes is a form of sugar, but it starts with the three letters ALL. And acute lymphoblastic leukemia is a form of leukemia, and its acronym is ALL. Now, this mapping is not untypical for the kinds of mappings that people create. It's an embarrassingly bad example, but it shows you that mappings are likely to include embarrassingly bad examples. Now, of course, we can have the mappings checked. We can have them manually checked. But that means you have to have manual checkers who are checking both of the ontologies regularly because both of the ontologies will be changing independently. And that's a very expensive commitment to have management oversight of mappings over time. And it's a commitment that people are not typically able to meet. And so mappings degrade. After a time, mappings become even less valuable than they were when they were originally created. So the upshot of all of this is that we need to reduce the need for mappings to the absolute minimum. We should not be reinventing the same wheel multiple different times, but rather we should find out how to invent the wheel once and then invent it once. Yep?
So, while mappings, your thoughts are that mappings will not serve a long-term solution, what are your thoughts on at least creating an initial set of mappings to help in ontology alignment as not to break systems from the get-go, but as a temporary measure?
So we're going to need temporary measures in any case. And when I said a few minutes ago that what I was describing was in some sense academic, visionary, it's forward-looking, I could also describe halfway solutions which are currently being implemented, which would involve something like what you say, which would necessarily involve something like what you say. But if we keep on with the present strategy, then we're just going to continuously make things work. And indeed, I foresee not merely that we'll be creating semantic silos, but we'll be creating mapping silos. And what we need to do is to find a prospective strategy for convergence upon common ontologies, rather than a strategy to save an unfortunate situation, which in any other area would be regarded as being obviously a wrong track. So wherever you can think of things which are important, a good example which I'll talk about in the afternoon is parcel tracking numbers. It was a big improvement in all of the parcel shippers' logistics when they came upon the idea that every parcel should have its own single number. Still, we'll come back to that later on. All right, so why should you care? Well, you'll lose data and so on and so on. So the question is how to do it right. Now, first of all, whatever we do has to be incremental. We're not going to solve all of the world's problems tomorrow. What we have to do is to try and find a way in which some of us can solve some of the world's problems within the next years, and in such a way that even at the very beginning we will see immediate benefits, so that we will get then the rewards for the first steps, which will enable further steps to take place. So we need a way of starting small, but then we need an evolutionary process so that the small beginnings will select what is worth pursuing further, and it will kill what is not worth pursuing further. And now that means one of the things that we need to make sure that we have is a way of killing ontologies. And I favor a really painful way of killing ontologies, so that people will learn that there is a risk to doing bad work, yes?
Painful for who?
Painful for the ontology, let's put it that way. So people should be aware that if they do bad work in ontology, then it will become apparent to other people that they're doing bad work in ontology. And at the moment, because we have this silo problem, there is really no comparison. There's no way in which you can say this is good and this is bad. It's just another silo. And you also have in the computer science world a presumption that there is no good or bad when it comes to an ontology. It's just what's useful or not useful. It's a social question. It's who's dominant? Who has the most money? What we need, if we're going to make this work, is criteria for when you can say that an ontology is good and when you can say that an ontology is bad. And then you need an agreement that people will pursue the good ones and they will junk the bad ones. And now, let me just give you some first idea about what that agreement would look like. So this is the Oboe Foundry. We'll be talking about that later on. The Oboe Foundry is just one example. There are now 3 or 4 such consortia. The Oboe Foundry arose as follows. In around about 2005, there were maybe 50 bio-ontologies which were being developed. Some of them were useful, they were much used, they were very prestigious, they had funding support, and the most important of those was the gene ontology, which I'll talk about later on. Some of them were tiny ontologies, the developers of which could not any longer be found, and they weren't very good anyway. But all of them were collected together in a library called the Oboe Library. The Oboe is open biomedical ontologies, or open biological and biomedical ontologies. So the Oboe Library was created with relatively minimal entry requirements. But within the Oboe Library, there were some ontologies, like the gene ontology, which had real community support, who were committed to eliminating silos in the way I've described. And so a subset of the Oboe Library ontology developers formed the Oboe Foundry. And the Oboe Foundry is designed to be a consortium of people who agree to build ontologies collaboratively with the goal of convergence upon one single ontology for each domain. Now, that's not trivial, as we shall see. What is a domain, for instance? But that was the goal, and the idea was that if two ontologies both want, or two ontology groups both want to deal with the same or with overlapping domains, then we would organize treaty negotiations so that they would agree to find a line across which they would devote their respective they would agree to find a line which would isolate the common area where they would share efforts, and then outside that common area they would have a strict division of labor, which means a division of terms. Now, this has a number of advantages. The number of ontologies you need to care about now is smaller. People know where to go to find ontologies which are being well maintained, which means that these are attractors for more users. As soon as you get more users of an ontology, you get more data, which is annotated using that ontology, and thereby the ontology itself gets more valuable. And so you have a positive feedback effect. You also incentivize people to work on the ontologies, because the more the ontologies are used, the more people care that they would be in a good quality. The more people do this, the more they learn about what is good quality. And then you can eventually formalize or formulate the principles of good quality ontologies, and then enforce them on the other people who agree to develop their ontologies collaboratively within this thing called the Oboe Foundry. Yep.
Scientific terminology has a tendency to evolve over time.
Yep.
So when something happens, like the idea that enzyme was a subclass of protein, but then it turns out, and so you build an entire ontology where enzyme is a subclass of protein, and then it turns out that some RNAs can have enzyme-like properties.
Yeah.
You need to revise the ontology, but how do you keep track of the meaning of the term when it was used at a particular time?
Good. So the ontology versioning issue is one issue which the Oboe community has been very concerned about from the very beginning, even before the Oboe Foundry. And so each of the Oboe ontologies is maintained using a versioning system. So there are release versions. The gene ontology also has working versions. And the working version of the gene ontology is updated every night, in fact. It turns out that it's very rare that you have massive re-architecturings of ontologies of the sort you describe. But even if you do, the idea of release versions enables you to keep track even of older annotations. So let me try and explain how this works. In the best case, it goes something like this. You have an ontology which is being used to annotate data about, say, zebrafish. The zebrafish information network is very concerned about the question you just raised, because they're investing lots of money in annotating, curating data using ontologies from one season to the next. And every time the gene ontology has a new version, there is somebody in the zebrafish team whose job it is to go through all the existing zebrafish annotations and check whether any of those annotations are affected by a change in the gene ontology. And you can do this with software rather easily now. Typically, it takes a few minutes every 6 months to check and to make a few fixes. But sometimes it takes real manual effort, because if a gene ontology term is split in something like the way you describe, then a human being needs to check whether it's this term that you now use in the new annotation or this term. So in this way, the zebrafish data curation effort is enabling you to establish what annotations meant when they were made, but also tell you what the current state of science is, which replaces the original annotations which have been changed.
But when you use ontologies to connect information resources that are managed by different people, this is where it seems to me you get into the problem that the zebrafish people may know they've changed the gene, but somebody from the outside who's referencing zebrafish data more incidentally than as a player, how does it propagate?
So there, the tooling, I believe, is not yet as sophisticated as some of the human efforts. So the zebrafish stands out in this because they have very clear commitments to this strategy of updating. Mostly when people go searching for zebrafish information, they're going to get back the most recent annotation, just by default. So they won't know about the previous annotations. If people are interested in older annotations for whatever reason, then they can get them, but they won't get them by default. The zebrafish case is an example of a good case. There are many examples of bad cases where it would be very difficult even to get the most recent version.
Yeah, I'm thinking of things like where in the Human Genome Project, you'd have a thing that was thought to be gene, and there were other things called intervening sequences, which were non-gene. And a gene might, after further study, become two genes with an intervening sequence in between, and then you had a fact in history that said this clone, this probe, hybridizes with that gene. But now the gene has become three things, two genes and an intervening sequence, and the probe is clearly not big enough to hybridize with all three, so it must hybridize with one. So you go from a bi-state logic to a tri-state logic that the query does this probe hybridize with these three genes turns into maybe, and with anything else turns into no.
So first of all, the gene ontology is not an ontology of genes. Right. It's an ontology of gene product attributes. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And,
Isn't that a problem which is completely independent of IT? Of IT, of computer science. It was already existing long before computers.
Yes,
it's generally a problem of taxonomies, of reference lists, and of all reference vocabulary, no matter whether it's stored in books or in programs or in databases. So
I think that his problem as a one-off instance would indeed be a problem that would be for a human being to solve. But I think there is a worry here that the more ontologies become established, the more even simple changes like the one that you describe may cascade through hundreds and hundreds of different databases, and then it's not a manual problem anymore, it's a software problem. And I do not believe that we are yet in a situation where we can keep track of those things consistently. It's still baby steps.
Yeah, it was years ago at a workshop, Peter Karp made the comment, this is when people were thinking largely relational databases, so he's using that terminology, but he said what's completely lacking in this field of interconnected information is any mechanism at all to support inter-database referential integrity. And I think the problem is still there.
I think that's an afternoon question.
Right.
So come back at me in the afternoon. Good. Now, if you go to PubMed, which is the main search resource for biomedical research articles, you will see that there has been a steady increase in the use of the term ontology and or controlled vocabulary over the years. And this increase continues as we speak. But if you go and look inside this data, you will see that there's one ontology which gets nearly all the attention when people are doing biomedical research. And that's the blue ontology here, which is the gene ontology. So the gene ontology overwhelms the other ontologies used by clinical researchers by far. Now, there are many reasons for this, but I think that at least one of those reasons is that the gene ontology is doing something which people find useful. The reason why they use the gene ontology is because they find it useful. Now, why is it useful? I think this is important for this community more than anything else. So it's useful because the gene ontology is a multi-species ontology, or it's a species-neutral ontology. What the gene ontology gives you is a list of terms with definitions structurally organized to support basic computer reasoning, which are terms used to describe the biology of every organism, whatever species it might belong to. Now, what that means is that if data is described using the gene ontology, data about mice or shrimp or whatever other organism you might be doing experiments with, then that data can be compared with corresponding human data. And so you can use the gene ontology as a bridge between the experiments you can do with model organisms and conclusions you might want to draw about human beings. And so that's why medical literature increasingly involves various methodologies which involve the gene ontology. So biostatistics now is a discipline which uses tools which have the gene ontology built in as a matter of course, because the gene ontology turns out to be so useful for statistical purposes when doing many, many different kinds of biomedical research. Now, in the same way, the gene ontology contributes to an additivity or a cumulativity of data. And in this respect, it's a bit like the International System of Units. If everybody is using the same terminology to describe certain basic biological phenomena, then all of those descriptions become compounded together, can be compared easily, in just the same way that by using kilograms and so forth, quantitative results of experiment can be compared easily. Now, the gene ontology is a simple hierarchy. Does anyone want me to go into this, or is it all clear? A more interesting example, a more interesting picture, actually. This is the foundational model of anatomy. How many people have not heard of the foundational model of anatomy? Okay, so the foundational model of anatomy is in some respects the paradigm of good quality ontology work. It's not perfect, but it really is better than anything else that I know. And it's divided along two major axes of the subtype or ISA axis and the part of axis. And so, for instance, the interlobar recess is a part of the pleural cavity, which is a subtype of serous sac cavity, which is a subtype of organ cavity, which is a subtype of anatomical space. This is a tiny, tiny fragment of a gigantic representation of human anatomy, of canonical human anatomy, which means a human being with all the normal parts. Now, the FMA can be applied rather easily to mammalian anatomy. Its structure is being used more generally. For instance, the plant ontology, which some of us here in this room work on, took the foundational model of anatomy, top-level structure, and used it to build the plant anatomy ontology. Now, this is the goal that we should be aiming for. This kind of clarity of top level and consistency between the part of structure and the subtype, supertype structure within an ontology. And the Go gets close to this. The Go is not quite so well crafted as the FMA, but then the FMA is dealing with anatomy, and anatomy is a rather easy domain. The Go is dealing with more complex domains, as we will see. So, why has the Go been successful? Well, it is clear about subtypes and supertypes. It has a coherent top level, like the FMA. It's monitored by domain specialists, which means that it's pretty much always up to date, and they have a very, very clever way of ensuring that. What happens is that the gene ontology is used by paid curators who spend their lives annotating experimental literature with gene ontology tags. So proteins which are mentioned in an article as being involved in apoptosis are tagged with the gene ontology term apoptosis, and anyone who's looking for literature on apoptosis, or on apoptosis in shrimp, or on apoptosis in shrimp neural tumor formation, can use those search terms, and they will find the relevant PubMed articles immediately. So you can use the gene ontology to search through medical literature in a very, very precise way. But now, because those curators are being paid to curate medical literature or experimental literature generally, they are also paid when they find errors in the gene ontology or gaps in the gene ontology to report those errors or gaps, which means that there is a constant feedback loop between the people using the ontology and the people maintaining the ontology. It has clear versioning principles, which we just talked about. Initially, it was low-tech. Now it's more sophisticated, logically speaking, but a community was developed who were perfectly happy with building and maintaining ontologies like the gene ontology because it was easy to do. It has clear documentation. It's open source. It's subjected to considerable critique, so some people hate it, which is good. It has a rapid turnaround tracker for people on the outside. So if you have a term which you would like to be included, then they have a guaranteed turnaround time for dealing with a term request. It's being used also for educational purposes, and the terms chosen are designed to be terms that biologists are already using. So no strange acronyms. It's designed to be something which biologists will be comfortable with. And the way it's used is to basically annotate data like this. So you associate natural language labels to make structured data cognitively accessible to human beings. And there are three sorts of labels which are used. Labels describing the parts of cells, labels describing the functions of molecules, and labels describing biological processes. So this is the really big one. It's not all biological processes. It's a slightly narrower set of what you can think of as canonical. Healthy is almost the right word. So not biological processes inside labs when you soak shrimp in mercury, for instance, to see whether they like it. Just normal biological processes. Now, this gives you about 30,000 terms, which are logically structured. Each one of them has a definition. And that's another key to the Go success, that you can actually find out what the terms mean because they supply definitions, which are quasi-standardized. All right, any questions? Yep.
It does not provide representation of diseases
Yep.
and symptoms. Can you tell us why that's a strength or that's good? Or?
So that's, in a way, a strength because it leaves room for the division of labor. And one of the keys to this prospective strategy I'm describing is that we need to find a way in which we can reap benefits from the division of labor without creating incompatible silos. So if the gene ontology had covered diseases, we would need still to create a module within the gene ontology for diseases. Instead, we create a separate ontology for diseases. But we do it in such a way that it's compatible with the gene ontology.
So it's seen as not generic enough to put it at the core, the generic core.
So this is an interesting question. If you look at this list, you agree that a disease is not a cell part. Tell me if you disagree. A disease is not a molecular function. Is a disease a biological process? Now, I think not, actually. I think that there are biological processes, for instance, immune system processes, which are involved in diseases. But the disease is not the immune system process. Immune system processes are in the gene ontology. So what is a disease? I'll talk about that later on. I will reassure you that diseases do exist, like mountains. But they're not trivial denizens of nature. So what happened was that the gene ontology established itself. It's three ontologies: an ontology of cellular components, an ontology of molecular functions, an ontology of biological processes. But it established itself, and people saw that there were gaps. And so we created the Oboe Foundry. The yellow parts are the gene ontology. And the idea is that diseases will go roughly here, anatomy will go here. We need some kind of an organism taxonomy here, and we use the NCBI taxonomy as a makeshift, but it's by no means an ideal solution. We now have a cell ontology here. We have a small molecule ontology. We have a sequence ontology. We have a protein ontology. We will have an RNA ontology. It's not yet ready for prime time. We don't yet have a cellular or organ function ontology. These are physiological issues which are still being worked on. We have a phenotypic quality ontology. We have an infectious disease ontology. We have some other disease ontologies, which I'll talk about later on. And then what else do we have? Well, I'll be talking later on in the day, I hope, about the environment ontology. So environments span granularities. So the vertical axis here goes from the very small, which is molecules, up to organs and larger things. And there are molecular and cellular environments just as there are environments for organisms. So the environment ontology has to be a cross-granular ontology. And then we also need, well, we have now, sort of, a population and community ontology. We have the acronym anyway.
There's an ontology.
There's an ontology, which is for population-level aggregates. And issues like species are going to arrive here. Species, families, demes, tribes. This has something to do with biodiversity, I guess. And then we will eventually need a population phenotype ontology and population process ontology, which may become part of the biological process ontology of the gene ontology, or not. That's something that has to be explored. Even just a couple of years ago, the gene ontology had no multi-organism processes. But more recently, it's added some multi-organism processes, for instance, involving interactions between bacteria and host organisms. But there are still no population-level processes within the gene ontology. I think I'm right in saying that. So this is the Oboe Foundry. As you can see, it is growing. Managing that growth is turning out to be very difficult because the goal here is to have a set of ontology modules which cover the whole of life. And there are even people who want to bring physics into the picture. So we would have a set of ontology modules which cover the whole of everything, which is hard work. And to manage that is quite tricky. And we didn't anticipate how tricky it would be. And so while we do have, for the things down here that I talked about, so we have very good relations between the pro, the FMA, the Go, the cell, which means this part. With regard to some of these other things, we are either we haven't made much progress yet, or we're having problems creating the bandwidth to ensure the necessary agreements are reached. So remember, we have treaty agreements. I'll give you one example where we do have an agreement. The protein ontology deals with proteins. Some proteins are regarded as cellular components. The gene ontology has a cellular component ontology which includes those proteins. So there seems to be a clash because the protein ontology wants to deal with protein complexes which are in the cell ontology, which are in the gene ontology. Well, we've solved that problem. We've found a way in which there can be non-redundancy between the Go and the Pro. And we've come to other such agreements in other areas too.
Yes, great. So it's looking at the for the population and community ontology, and it looks like there's
Don't look at me. Look in that direction.
There's a Google code site for it, and it says in the Google code site that it's rooted in the basic formal ontology, and I looked at the basic formal ontology, but it's not on the list. So I was just curious what you mean by rooted in the basic formal ontology.
Well, Barry, you should actually about the basic
I can
formal.
answer that and will answer that question in just a few slides.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, it basically means that the upper level, the sort of root terms for the population community ontology are terms from the basic formal ontology. So
Yeah,
all the classes of the PCO are subclasses of BFO terms.
Okay, but
I'll explain how that
I was
works.
referring more to I think how it's administered, I guess.
Yes, so then I think I can talk about that in general terms now. So all of the Oboe Foundry ontologies are designed to be interoperable with each other, so that it's really a common team effort. And that means that they have to share a common top-level ontology. Either they start ab initio from this common top-level ontology, which is called basic formal ontology, and populate downwards. So each term is defined as a subclass of some term in buffer. Or they reverse engineer. So the gene ontology was reverse engineered in a way to be conformant to buffer. And so they have a common top-level ontology, and there has to be a certain information sharing. So when Ramona started work on the PCO, then she informed people, I'm going to create this thing, and these will be the top level, and this will be the domain. And so everyone knows that if they want to work on a population ontology, they should be talking to Ramona. And as long as they are committed to the idea of collaborative ontology development and to the division of labor and so forth, then they will follow those rules.
Did they set up rules for this collaboration?
Is that
Did they establish a guidance rules or a governance for that?
We have governance rules. The governance rules are rules which are based upon ideas such as the following. Each ontology will have an editor-in-chief, as it were, who will also be the liaison with the coordinating board of the whole Oboe Foundry. And the coordinating board of the whole Oboe Foundry determines things like when treaty meetings need to be held, what the top level should be, what the preferred syntax should be, those kinds of questions. So general questions are dealt with by the coordinating board, and the individual ontologies are otherwise pretty free to do what they want within the rules. And now where the hurdles arise is the following. In N number of months, Ramona will be ready with a version of PCO which she wants to be submitted to the Oboe Foundry for membership. But that means we have a review process, and the review process is also formulated in terms of rules. What we do not have are sufficiently many skilled reviewers, because reviewing means finding holes, finding gaps, criticizing, shouting, wheedling, needling, and that's the hard part. And we've managed to get the review process underway for the first group of ontologies. Now we're coming to the second group of ontologies, and it's been delayed because of these manpower or resource issues. And that's partly because we really do have a shortage of expertise at doing this governance-based ontology development. Because you need to be an expert at ontology and a domain expert, and you need to have governance. So maybe we'll just give this to the Austrian government and let them deal with it.
Yeah, when I look at the terms population and community, those are, you appended ontology to them, but those are actually subdisciplines of a field called ecology. So if you went to an ecology department, you would learn population ecology and community ecology, which is the study of organisms interacting at those levels of organization that have some, a number of, but somewhat formalized definitions. So I think, this is where my group has been working largely with the realm of ecology. There's a lot of engagement with earth sciences there, earth and environmental sciences. So OBO, the B stands for?
Biological and biomedical.
Oh, it's BBO.
well, it started biological, then it was changed to biomedical for grantsmanship reasons, and some people now want to go back to biological, but the working compromise is that really we mean biological and biomedical.
I see. So, but I think that this is a really good point, because I would obviously be interested in PCO. I mean, it would be really important to my clients. But at the same time, what the earth and environmental sciences, like the geosciences, geography, oceanography, they've got their own semantic sectors.
Yeah.
And do you see everything happening inside of OBO?
No, on the contrary, I'm a big believer in the division of labor, and so I would be really happy if a group could be formed which would deal with environments, ecology, evolution. Those kinds of topics have not really had the attention that they deserve within the Oboe community, because there is still a tendency to lean in the direction of what will be relevant to human health. And
so you have the environmental ontology that was cutting across all the levels of biological organization. And you know, I've looked at a lot of these ontologies, and from the perspective of an ecologist, there are often a lot of terms that are either missing or showing disciplinary specialization that wouldn't be appropriate for my domain.
Pierre, are you listening? No. So
I think he is listening. He probably has his mic on mute right now.
Okay. So in the hope that Pierre is listening, the person who is the de facto developer of the Envo ontology in Bremen, I'm working with him to try and clean up the top level. But I think that we need to make the environment ontology a workable solution. We need ecologists and we need geographers, above all, to be more involved. And we've tried to involve geographers who find all kinds of problems with the environment ontology. Pierre, can you hear me? So we were talking about the next steps within the environment ontology, and I was just stating that we need to involve ecologists and geographers to a much greater degree than we have so far. And there is sorry, I don't know your name.
Mark you're refining what has been, I guess Melvin will be able to tell you about that too. The initial formation phase of Envo was a greedy term capture, grabbing in ideas, trying to define the domains that existed. And now the refinement process, Barry and myself are going through the top levels, trying to align them to the basic DFO. And then it will start defining the domains more clearly and precisely. And then the division of labor to the geographers, the geospatial scientists, and the ecologists, and arriving at definitions that are both accurate in a domain sense, but functional in an ontological sense. This will then proceed from there.
So I guess we should try and recruit you to be part of this.
But there are other major efforts. For instance, in the Earth Sciences suite, has a huge number.
That's SWEET.
Yeah.
Yes. So we should probably talk about that offline. So I think that there are problems with Suite, which is that they really did build those things very quickly, and sometimes it shows. But they have the right sort of principles, so they do believe in the division of labor, in modules, and so forth. I also think that we need to explore how we can get the suite, with a SUITE, of ecological and environmental ontologies created in a way which will be maximally effective. And that means that the specialists in the domains will respect these things as being sufficiently terminologically mature to meet their needs. Okay, so not everything should go in here, and I would be really happy if we could find other ways of parceling out some of the work. So there is something called the NIF standard, which is the Neuroinformatics framework standard, which is based on the same methodology. It takes some parts of this, but then develops neurological ontologies in a much greater detail and systematicity. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to, I think that we need to promote within the biodiversity area. So, any more?
I guess the answer to Mark's question still isn't entirely clear to me. When you're saying that you want to bring in geographers and earth scientists to achieve a better division of labor, do you mean bring them into Oboe Foundry, or do you mean bring them into the entire effort to form their own sort of open earth sciences?
So my suggestion, which is a very, it comes out of my own appreciation that this is an over-ambitious scheme here. My suggestion and hope is that the community of people interested in an ontologically mature, controlled vocabulary for ecology, environment terms would create some approach along these lines. Now, at the moment, there are geographic terms in ENVO. Should they be in ENVO, or should they be in something like GEO, which would be created and maintained by geographers? That is not for me to decide, but it has to be decided, because at the moment we have the worst of both worlds. And I have tried, believe me, to recruit geographers to this effort. I do not, well, I did do quite a lot of work myself on geographic ontology, but not of the sort which would help here, unfortunately.
I should add, we had a workshop in Dagstall as well, where we had geographers that came to that with David, Mark, and various other people as well, who gave us their perspective as well. For example, we had things like a river in environment ontology. A geographer considers a river to be the container which water can flow in, whereas we were thinking of the material entity of water that's flowing in a river. But of course you can have dry river beds and things like that as well. So that's where their perspective becomes very, very different. And particularly ethno-geographers, where you start going and seeing what Aboriginal people and things like that consider to be the kind of geographic aspects, and that again gets very, very different to what current modern geographers have in their notions.
So, and I think that there is no obvious community here on the geographic side. You have ethno-geographers, you have the common sense geographers. We're all common sense geographers. And then you have people in specific sciences, for instance, sciences which collect bacterial samples, who use geographic terms scientifically. And I think it's the third community that we need to attract, but we need to get terms that they use in the ontology in a way that geographers with geographic affiliations will respect. That's the trick.
Maybe you're also assuming that all geographers are the same, but within geography, I mean, it's so broad, there's not one thought within geography.
Yes,
so,
that's true, that's true.
You know, there's cartography, and there's biogeography, and those two groups think of...
So I actually did, at one stage, some experimental work with geographers on, in the ethnogeography of adult geographic knowledge. So what do people mean by geographic? And we discovered that, that there's very little, actually, that is universal. So the best we could come up with was that the majority of people in several cultures, because we did experiments in different language cultures, the most common, stable way of understanding what geographic means was, can be represented on a map.